The Kevin Durant trade is arguably the biggest trade in NBA history, and it could be an absolute disaster for the Phoenix Suns. And if you give me about 10 or 12 minutes, I'm going to explain to you exactly why. So here's what we know about the Suns. At the end of last season, they suffered arguably the most humiliating elimination in NBA playoff history. They were a 64-win team. They were a 1 seed, and they lost by 30 at home in Game 7 in a game that they were never in. This is a team that not only won 64 games last year, but made the finals the year prior as well. Then they go into this season, and the vibes are just not right. They're coming off of an offseason in which they're actively trying to get Kevin Durant after his first trade request. DeAndre Ayton is involved in those trade talks. Ultimately, Ayton re-signs with the team only because he had to. He was a restricted free agent. Indiana offered him a contract. Phoenix matched it. Ayton clearly is not happy to be there. The vibes are completely off. They start this season, they're not healthy at all, and they're basically a 500 team at the time that they make the KD trade. And that trade involves them trading away 2 good young wings, some of the most valuable player types in the entire league, and 4 future first-round picks in exchange for a 34-year-old that tore his Achilles a couple of years ago, has injured his knee in the exact same way 2 seasons in a row, and has played over 40,000 minutes in the NBA. And if you say all that out loud, and you take away the team name, and you take away the players' names, there's one thing that comes to mind for me, and that is desperation. It feels like a desperate move. It feels like a team that was drowning, that didn't have that much of a future, that was a contender and no longer was, and clearly was declining, grasping its straws, trying to figure out a way to be a contender once again. And desperation generally does not result in very good moves in the NBA. And the only reason that they made this deal is because they brought in a new owner. Robert Sarver would not have made the Kevin Durant trade. He didn't want to include Mikal Bridges in the Kevin Durant trade in the offseason, and he didn't want to have to pay all the money that you would have to continue to contend at the level you would need to after bringing in Kevin Durant. If Matt Ishbia does not buy the Suns, they don't acquire Kevin Durant. It's a common thing for a new owner to come in. They want to make a splash, and his splash potentially ruined the team. And there's a reason that previous ownership didn't want to make the Kevin Durant trade in this past offseason when they had the opportunity to, and it wasn't just money. It's because this was a successful team. They won 64 games last year, one of the best records in league history. They made the finals 2 years ago, and Mikal Bridges and Cam Johnson were critical pieces of each of those teams, and they just traded them away for a guy that, as I said, is in his mid-30s and has had injury issues. So let's talk about the reasons that everybody said that this trade was actually a good idea. First and foremost, everybody's talking about Phoenix as a finals contender now. Arguably the best team in the Western Conference. Are they? Because Chris Paul has clearly gotten worse this year, is declining, is very old. DeAndre Ayton doesn't really want to be there. He's a good player, but his motivation level seems to be an all-time low all season long. Booker has missed a ton of time this year, and then you add KD into this as well. That feels like a lot of things up in the air for a team to integrate. Yes, one of the best players in the league in Kevin Durant, but to put all of this together, a team that wasn't close to competing before they made the trade, to put all that together and make a real finals run is going to be a challenge. It's not going to be something that's going to be super easy and everything's going to be fine just because you traded for Kevin Durant. And then the other point that people love to say about this trade is that Phoenix had to make the trade, right? They weren't going anywhere. Chris Paul is declining. All these things I've said in the video, and this puts them into contention status. Well, I'm not really sure they had to make the trade, because when you look at the roster and specifically the players that they traded away in the Durant trade, everybody other than Chris Paul is on the same timeline, like Booker, Ayton, Cam Johnson, Mikal Bridges. These guys are all on the same timeline, and they're a Chris Paul replacement away from getting back to finals level contention. How do I know that? Because 2 years ago, they were in the finals, and last year they were the favorites in the Western Conference before a disaster of a playoff series. And so if you want to say that they had to make the trade to be contenders, the last 2 years of evidence in Phoenix Suns history shows you that that wasn't the case. All they needed, more than likely, was a replacement for Chris Paul. They could have waited until the offseason or try to do something at the deadline where they trade Paul and a couple of first-round picks in exchange for someone that's better than him, and then all of a sudden they're back to what they were. I'm not sure that they had to make the trade to be contenders in the long term. Yes, this specific season, it makes them better. It makes them better title contenders. But in the long term, it's not like the rest of this roster outside of Chris Paul was 34 years old. These guys are still young, improving, and on the same timeline. And they just cut half that timeline away to bring in someone that's way closer to what Chris Paul is in terms of their trajectory of their career in Kevin Durant than what the rest of the roster was outside of Chris Paul. And because of how Phoenix struggled to begin the season, it's so easy to forget how good those teams were and how important Bridges and Cam Johnson were to those teams, because the secret to those Phoenix teams was not necessarily star power. It was depth, it was size, it was defensive versatility. They never put bad basketball players on the floor, and then they were awesome in late game situations. They were the best team in the league the last 2 years at winning in close games. And the only thing out of all those things I mentioned that made the Suns great, that KD helps them with more than Bridges and Johnson did, is being better late in games. They were already awesome at that. They're not going to have as much depth. They're not going to have as much size. They're not going to have as much defensive versatility. And yes, they'll be better late in games, but that was already their top tier strength, and it took away all these other strengths and made them into weaknesses. Like, let's say we get to the postseason, they're matched up with Luka or LeBron. Like, who's guarding those guys? Torrey Craig's going to run out there and guard those guys? Like, yes, KD has been awesome defensively this year. Booker's an improved defender. Ayton has gotten better at defending the rim, but like, they had those guys. Yes, Luka still killed them last year in the postseason, but Bridges still is one of the better perimeter defenders in the league. They still had size. They still had options. They don't have options for those guys outside of just outscoring the other team. And yes, they're going to have a pretty good chance to do that, but it's not like those last 2 seasons of Suns teams were awful. They were one of the best teams in the league, and they just cut away half of that. But the interesting part of all this is this argument isn't even centered around this season. Every argument I've made to this point has been about what it means for them this year, but the real negative of this trade is what it means for the future of the Phoenix Suns. Because everybody right now is assuming, oh, they're going to go on to win the title, they're going to have a great season. What if they can't figure it out? Guys can't get healthy. Chris Paul breaks down in the playoffs again. Let's say they lose in the second round, just like they did last year. Then you're going into the offseason. Chris Paul's 38, KD's 35, Ayton's still unhappy, he wants a bigger role, maybe he wants to go to a different team, and Booker's still there, but outside of him, you don't have a lot to look forward to. Then if next year the same thing happens, you know, one mistimed injury from Chris Paul or KD, things we've seen happen for each of the last couple of seasons, then all of a sudden KD's looking at a new contract, maybe a different team, these guys are older, and you don't have any of your first round picks. This offseason, even if Phoenix wanted to, they can't trade any of their future first. They don't have a first in this upcoming draft. Their ability to add to this team and improve is so limited. And if they don't win the title this year or next year, it's over. We're looking at a possibility of not having those first round picks, Devin Booker potentially looking for a new team, maybe Ayton continues to be unhappy. This guy's the former #1 overall pick. I don't think he's going to be super excited about going out there and setting pick and rolls 50 times a game for all these other guys and they're all getting shots. At some point, he's going to want a bigger role. It's clear that he's unhappy in Phoenix. There's so many more things up in the air that I feel like people realize with this deal. And at some point, one of these teams that's trading away all these future firsts and all these pick swaps is going to get burned. At some point, what's happening in Boston right now with Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, that's going to happen for one of these other teams, whether it's the Nets trading away all those picks for Harden, whether it's the Suns trading away all these picks for KD, whether it's the Lakers trading away all those picks for Anthony Davis, and on and on and on and on and on. At some point, somebody's going to get burned, and they're going to have traded away the equivalent of Jaylen Brown, the equivalent of Jason Tatum, and create a dynasty the way that we are seeing potentially in Boston for the next couple of seasons. It's going to happen, and Phoenix might be that team that it happens to. And so yes, they're better this year. They have a better chance of winning the title. And next year, once they get everybody all coalesced together, even if it doesn't work out this year, they're still going to be possibly the title favorites. But there's way more risk involved than I feel like people realize. Now, having said all those things, congratulations to those of you that made it towards the end of the video, because this isn't actually my opinion. I just wanted to make the argument because it felt so one-sided, including myself, felt so one-sided. Phoenix had to make the deal. I feel like they did. They weren't contenders before the trade, then they made the trade. Now they're contenders. They've raised their ceiling. As good as those 2 young wings are, those future first-round picks are, and be nice to have, KD is KD. It's arguably the most talented, the best player that's ever been traded in the history of the league. It's arguably the biggest trade in the history of the league, as I said in the intro. So even though this isn't how I feel like it's worth pointing out the downsides, because everybody's so excited about what this team could be, and they're all passing up what could potentially be a disaster in Phoenix. It's just like when the Clippers brought in Paul George and Kawhi, and I looked at that deal and I said, hey, this looks cool, but there is another scenario where Shea's awesome and all these picks matter and the Thunder get really good and you don't actually ever make a finals or win a title because these guys are hurt all the time. And that's kind of what's happened with the Clippers. There's always a downside. Everybody gets excited about the upside at first, but if they lose in the second round, things don't go the way they want to this year, this could be an absolute disaster for Phoenix. And even though that's not how I actually feel, again, congrats for making it to the end of the video, I felt the need to point it out anyway.